Now you're alive and not muted.
Okay, welcome to House Education on Tuesday, February 4th, 2025, broadcasting from our new studio here. We are continuing our conversation on the governor's proposal for moving to a foundation formula style funding system. We're going to have a little presentation that is designed to address some of the questions that came up last week, and then we'll have some time for quick questions. Welcome back to Secretary of Education and the Deputy Secretary of Education. Welcome back, and the floor is yours.
Good afternoon. I'm Zoe Saunders, Secretary of Education, joined by Deputy Secretary
Jill Briggs Campbell, Deputy Secretary of Education, and we're joined by Amanda and Justin, your friends from APA. Can't see up there. They're there.
We appreciate the opportunity to circle back on the presentation from last week. In that presentation, we provided more details around the funding formula that went more specific into the actual numbers and the calculations. We did capture some of the questions that you posed, and we put together a slide deck to at least respond to those initial questions and then open it up for further discussion to make sure that we can fully respond to any areas of inquiry. Foundation formula. So these were the common questions that we heard last week. Specifically, how is the funding formula applied as we think about it related to CTE funding model? So we would like to spend a little bit of time talking about that, along with the breakdown of the recommended funding per student. We did have some questions around how that is adjusted to our current scale in Vermont, and we wanted to spend more time expanding on what went into the modeling. We also received many questions around how the overall spending in the proposal compares to our current spending. We did put together some slides to elucidate more of a better understanding of that, and also to kind of reinforce how we approach this work and where we see adjustment in overall spending based on the evidence model. So from that, I will turn it over to get into the details with Amanda Brown walking us through the specifics of the funding program.
Thank you, Zoe. And I'm actually going to turn it to Justin for just a few slides and then switch back over.
The new
He's there.
Great. So,
hi, Justin.
Hey, good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for having us back. So the first slide here is just a reminder of the different pieces, the different adjustments, what's in the foundation formula, what is still funded outside the foundation formula, and the scale of each of those adjustments. So just a reminder, base funding at $13,200. That funding is for all long-term ADM. Economically disadvantaged students would receive a weight of 0.75. The EL students a weight of 1.5. CTE funding is both coming through the base and then this additional 1.3 weight, and that CTE center funding. We'll get more into the detail there. The triple E count still funded at negative 0.54. In part, as we've discussed, not something that we've really reviewed and done a deeper dive on. The district sparsity weights still related to the current tax of capacity weights that are in the formula. And the size adjustment, similar to the current weights, but applied differently and kind of created differently. And so I'll walk through that. All of that is what's in the foundation. So effectively, foundation funding is your base and your weights. And then over in the blue, those additional funds that come through categoricals, some things to highlight. Special education funding, still going to have the same categorical amount plus we estimate about 70 million. And that's about $840, not per just special ed students, but $840 per each long-term ADM. Transportation increased by about 25 million or $300 per student. And then have the other categoricals still in place, like state place students and some other uses. So again, kind of what's the total pot available to districts as we go forward. We'll go to the next slide.
Can I ask you to hold a second? We have a couple of questions. Representative Brady.
Is the sparsity weight just staying as is from our current system right now? Like what we consider sparsity and how that is calculated?
Yes, and as we've talked about, we do think, a deeper dive into that would be good. We didn't really have a place to go with research that had been done previously to kind of look at a different approach. And so for right now, we're leaving that in there.
Okay, so nothing further in terms of, or like geographic, better defining sort of geographic necessity versus
Not at this, not at this.
historical sparsity. Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
And then my second question is, maybe you're gonna get to this. Can you explain more? I had this question from my district yesterday, that $70 million increase in special education. So the census, you're leaving the census block grant functioning as it does now. Why that number? Where, how is that fitting into it?
Amanda
Yes.
can speak to that.
Yep, and I can speak to that. So when we looked at current spending by districts on special education, there was a delta of about 70 million between what they were receiving through the census block and other state funds and federal funds, and what they were spending out of local budget decisions. So moving to the foundation formula, you need to account for the fact that your communities we're raising locally an additional 70 million in special education. So for now, we have included it in the categorical as an addition to the census block grant. That's a policy decision. You could also think about rolling it into the base if you wanted to have take a different choice on how much restriction you want around its use and where that fits in maintenance of fiscal support and maintenance of effort requirements. But it's attempting to capture the fact that you're currently spending more on special education than is received from state and federal grant sources.
And if I can just add a note there, so it's an attempt, and I think the right one, to not shortfall the special education spending, but we've also talked quite a lot about the need for, as we saw in Act 173, the intention was to reduce special education spending, and we haven't realized the changes in educational delivery that would likely result in that reduction of costs. So long term, the reason that we sort of left this system as is, and then ensuring that we're sort of not shortfalling it, is to give that time and space to make those changes to special ed delivery to achieve kind of the goals of Act 173 and hopefully realize those cost savings.
To a much lesser extent, I assume transportation is the same thing.
Same, right? So, I think that you could conceptualize that not having, 52 plus separate contracts would probably result in some cost savings, but we don't know what that looks like yet, right? So not wanting to shortfall transportation, which we already know is a cost that districts are carrying.
Yeah, and right now your system is set up to reimburse up to 50%. So that's why we doubled the amount that was in the transportation categorical to allow for up that 100%.
And I think it's important just to reinforce that this is a multi-year approach. And so as we're looking at the first several years of implementation, we're assuming that we're going to carry some additional cost and that there would be a further review and evaluation of how to better, implement some best practices as intended to support higher education quality and also efficiency. And I just want to reinforce that's why we're baking in a lot of these assumptions now and making explicit where we've identified those carryover costs. Also with transportation, there's an assumption of increasing that because right now we reimburse that at 50%. And so that's modeling in some additional transportation support to be able to provide that service. So I know I'll kind of kick it off. I know as we look at the first question when the Larry Pikus model was presented was how does this fit within the Vermont context? Because our the assumptions around that base funding are built upon a much larger school. And so part of the work that APA has supported us with is understanding how we would make those adjustments to really align with our current scale. So I want to smooth out those trends too. So I'll let Amanda, you walk through and orienting to this chart around how those adjustments are made based on size of the school.
Sure. Thank you, Zoe. Exactly to your point. So right now, your current system does provide some adjustments for small schools that are in sparsely populated areas with kind of a flat adjustment for under 100 students and under 250 students. So we have modeled an alternative to that provides a smooth curve. So you don't have what we would think about as funding cliffs if you had 99 students or 101 students receiving very different funding. We have also, to Secretary Sanders' point, put that in relationship to what's in the base, knowing that the base is much larger schools than on average. So instead of only providing an adjustment under 250 student schools, we are providing an adjustment under 450 schools, and then allowing that to ramp up as far as it goes. So what you can see here on the right is when you take that formula and apply it to different school enrollments, what's that extra weighting that you generate? And that ranges from 0 in your larger settings to what's shown here, 0.35 for 50 students, and even higher if you only had 10 students, 1 student if you happen to have such a scenario. And then to the right in that column is just the amount of additional funding that's generated. So last time when we were thinking about what's the funding that's in that base, knowing that that base amount is the amount of funding you receive in your absolute, and not your absolute largest, but in your largest schools, and that in your smaller schools, you would receive additional funding. And you can see that at, say, an average school of 200 students would be about $1,700 more per student. So let's switch over to the next slide. And Justin, I think you were going to walk through this one if you'd like to.
Hang on a second.
Oh, pause. Okay.
Yeah, first of all, I'm getting questions from folks asking if they have the slide
Yeah,
available to
really
us.
hard.
Let's just see about it. I was,
It was sent over, I think. No?
I don't know.
Okay. I'll make sure it's correct.
and
Sorry
then,
about that.
when we get
And by the way,
into,
that was on me. I'm taking, Amanda, I appreciate you taking a sorry on that. That was totally my fault. I did not.
No problem, Bill.
when we talk about small school, formula adjustments,
Mhm.
we're really only talking about those that today qualify for a sparsity
So
and size. As opposed
that is
to, this is all new, and if you got a school that's 50 kids, you get this automatically.
That is a great question. So we're actually recommending that at the start that this adjustment be applied to all schools, regardless of if they're in a sparse area. And then over time, you develop what we would consider eligibility criteria, or defining what it really means to be necessarily small. And necessarily small could be because you're in a geographically sparse area. It could be because you have facilities constraints and you can't consolidate 2 schools because neither school could support both populations. So the adjustment itself would at the beginning be applied to all schools, and then over time only applied to those that are deemed eligible or necessarily small based on criteria that haven't been set yet. But thinking about those things about geographic constraints, facility constraints, the things that make them necessarily small by necessity and not choice.
Representative Hunter.
So if I'm reading this right, for the
Yeah.
very smallest school, the foundation grant is 24,000 per pupil? Or is that with, if they had all those needs?
That would be if they had the average.
Step one.
Yep. So let's stay with step 1 for just a second. I think that will
Okay,
help
sorry.
answer your question.
Yeah.
Nope, no problem.
But I think
Go ahead. Uh-huh.
you highlighted a really key part of what we're laying out here is everything kind of step 2 down is assuming the average per pupil or per student amount across the state. So clearly some schools will have more, some schools will have less. But in the top, in step 1, what we're really identifying is the main difference for, in kind of per pupil funding, outside the average is going to be school size. And so if you look at the first subtotal, you would have funding based on school size that ranges from the base, 13,200, any school that's 450 or larger, all the way up to $17,766 in a school with 50 students. Then when you go down below, the average adjustment in the state for district sparsity is $721 per student. Clearly that's going to occur in some places and not in others, but that's the average. And that's really what we showed everywhere else is the average. But what you'll see if you go to the far right column is that on average, you have about $7,500 additional dollars per student going in the system for the school and student adjustments that we laid out in kind of that in the slide up above where you look at all the weights. And so I think it's easy to, think a lot about 13,200 and this number that's very different, but you're going to have all these things stacked on top of it. And based on, individual district characteristics, this 20,726 will be higher and lower, but on average in the state, that's kind of what the funding will look like when you include all the different adjustments.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Bless you.
And so, kind of taking that table above and then putting into just that where, the overall pie, where do the dollars come from? What you'll see is still the majority of dollars are going to come from the base. It's a little under 2/3 of the dollars would be coming out of the base. The next biggest pot of additional dollars will be for your economically disadvantaged students. So that's that 75% additional funding for every economically disadvantaged student. You have about 3 adjustments that are kind of similar in scale. The additional funding coming from categoricals. And so that includes a handful of pots of money, that district sparsity, and the school size. And again, that's the school size when it's being applied to all schools before that criteria is put in place. Your EL weight, if you kind of go back to the top, is the biggest overall weight, but it's being applied to just fewer students than your other weights. And so though it's the biggest weight, it's only going to generate about 2% of the funding. And then CTE, there's again, it's going to be funded over to the BOCES. And so it's not in the going directly to districts, but it's about 3% of the overall funding when you think about the total pot available.
And also if we could, Justin, you can emphasize what is built into the base, because there's also assumptions built in around expanding college and technical education programs in the middle school area, expanding elective opportunities, early childhood education, and being able to reinvest in higher teacher salaries.
Yeah, again, that base is adjusted for kind of Vermont context, for Vermont priorities. And so additional funding from, on top of the evidence-based model for mental health and behavioral health, needs for students, those additional staff at the high school to ensure really a robust college and career readiness program and the ability to have that, those different courses, additional electives time for your middle school students, and then traditional school-based CTE also, right? So above the kind of center-based career and technical education, career and technical education opportunities, both at middle school and high school, built into the base amount.
Do you have a number that's assigned that specific? I don't need the number. I just want to know that there's actually like a number that you have modeled that says this is what we think it'll cost to bring CTE programs to the middle school level in some way, shape, or form.
In the education funding report that we released last week, there's a table that itemizes the specific resource allocation and assumptions that are built into that. And so a lot of that is assuming certain number of teaching staff that would be required to deliver on that programming. And as we shared last week, we wanted to take an evidence-based approach to ensure that the state dollars could deliver a high quality and robust education, but districts have flexibility with how they spend that. And so that there is local decision-making within this framework to allow for those adjustments. But the modeling around kind of the assumptions and what would be required to deliver on expanded CTE and so forth is built in.
On page 7 of
Page
the
7.
report.
Presentation is now up.
Thank you.
Okay, I do have a question about this chart or just the base funding in general. Does it take into account Vermont's, frankly, overwhelming school construction needs?
So the base amount does not take into account the construction needs. It has funding for your ongoing maintenance and operations, but it does not have additional funding for facilities needs. And kind of best practice is not to have facilities funding in your ongoing operational funding, in part because, that funding will fluctuate in need over time. But we recognize, and I think we talked about in the policy brief and other places, there's a clear need for understanding facility costs that are out there and creating a program to start taking care of that.
Yeah, I'm having deja vu because I think I asked that question. You gave me the answer.
Yeah, sorry. Sorry, there's a lot to cover. Let's say it again. And so Rep. Conlon just wanted to, the maintenance and operations, again, that's on page 7. And then folks can see in the table above kind of how that might break out in terms of staff, aiming for that 3% that we always talk about that we don't achieve, that national standard. So it is that ongoing investment in the buildings that we know has been severely underfunded. Absolutely. Construction is a different question.
how would you envision that would work under this funding formula? Would that fall into a district has the ability to raise additional funds above and beyond or what do you do if you know, you're ready to consolidate 3 high schools into a comprehensive high school?
And the way we've approached this is that, there's some staging that needs to happen in order to think through how we can prioritize those investments. So what's built into the base is to make sure that we're able to maintain our schools so they're not running into the situation 10 years from now where we have significant deferred maintenance. We know that right now, many of our school buildings have significant maintenance challenges, and that there's a need for construction improvements. We also need to be thoughtful around where we're going to invest those state dollars. So part of this plan is really thinking strategically around how to have those conversations around consolidation. And then there still is the question around how that will be funded. But we know that that's part of the model. This is baked in to understand kind of year over year how we could support. But certainly this approach is helping us to prioritize and understand, within our portfolio of schools, where to invest those dollars, or to your point, to enhance the opportunities within the district. So it's assuming that there's a staged approach to this and that there's still a need for, exploring additional funding sources for the construction aid to address the deferred needs.
And that would be what I'm trying to derive from that is that, so what you're saying is that it would be a state-funded, state-targeted construction aid program that would cover 100% of construction. So if it was,
I guess what I would say, I think there's a lot of policy considerations, right? And so what this proposal is contemplating is that we first need to really kind of stabilize our system, do the work within kind of the new districts to identify where there are opportunities for consolidation, where that would be best served. Then there's exploration around how to fund that and how the school construction aid program would take shape.
So it's TBD.
Yeah. And I would say that, as we really have dug into the work of around school construction for the past 2 years, what we know is that things like master planning, facilities master planning is critical, right? So it's never just what are we doing with one building? It's what is the role of that building in terms of our larger portfolio, our strategic vision, our enrollment patterns, our ed specs. There's so much work that we still need to do. And then I think also, as Secretary Saunders was just saying, a lot of this work really needs to happen on the ground. And I think that, I get a lot of phone calls from superintendents and facilities managers saying, like, do we just stop? Do we just stop having conversations? And we say, no, please continue to have your conversations. You know which buildings, are in dire shape. You know which buildings are under enrolled. But how might you have these conversations if you were under a different governance structure? And so I think we all know that when our schools have clarity on what the direction is from the state, when they know where we're heading, they're really good at having these conversations. And we see a role for the state in supporting that, but it really has to happen on the ground. There's a level of detail that needs to go into those decisions. And how do you have those conversations if you don't know the direction that the state is going? So as I've said before, that I'm as eager as anybody to move this work forward, but we also need to be cautious here because we really genuinely don't know what the sort of education landscape is going to look like. Once we know that, we can start to move and plan and have those conversations.
Well, it is very challenging because everything is contingent on the other thing happening. And, so if we look at sort of the 4-year implementation phase of everything that the governor has proposed, we have Woodstock High School that 4 years ago wanted to move ahead with the bond. And everybody's sort of stuck. And we say, let's just say Governor Scott's proposal, we do everything. Well, it really wouldn't be 4 years till, seems to me, before we'd even start talking about how we're going to fund school construction. And that would just be, I think, challenging.
So I think this approach is setting the stage for having the conversations around the school construction aid approach for Vermont.
Yeah.
And I hear as we talk about that multi-year timeline, it's going to be important for us to get concrete around at what point do we evaluate that and what are some of the preconditions for us to be able to move forward with that approach. I think a lot of the planning to date has happened in more of a local context. And as Jill often says, if we think about these lines, districts as dotted lines and you expand them, there may be different ways that we're going to review and evaluate where to invest in facilities. And so this work is really a precursor for the state to think about school construction aid and how we can really target and be strategic around those investments within kind of a future state of our school portfolio.
Yeah, I mean,
Allow us to
those
take that
are,
back
honestly, that's, setting the stage to have the conversation, I think, to somebody with a dire construction need or a strong desire to start planning one.
Right.
Is hard to hear.
Right. And I think we always have to prioritize if there are safety concerns or health concerns, that needs to be always prioritized and to be able to address that. So we have heard this question, I think, twice in the last couple of weeks. So let us just kind of come back as we think about this as part of the longer roadmap for the plan. But I do see that a lot of the preconditions for a school construction aid would be built in to this phased approach because you're necessarily within the new district model doing planning and thinking about how to establish really effective feeding patterns in elementary, middle, and high. There's an evaluation around the schools. We'll be having further conversations as a state around how do we define schools that are small by necessity versus schools that are small by choice. What you're seeing built into this modeling is some assumptions that we're going to maintain a lot of our current portfolio now, while giving us time to be more thoughtful and planful around establishing that criteria. So all of that is supportive of moving in a direction and thinking about how we're going to prioritize that. But I do think it's important for us to just circle back and be able to provide some more clarity around where we look at this on the timeline.
Just real quickly,
Yes.
you've mentioned a number of times the small by choice, small by necessity, and I'm gonna ask, are you aware of how many school districts out there, keeping that in mind, who are trying to merge and can't because of school construction aid not being available? I know there are school districts like that. I have some in my district. And I wonder how widespread that is, because I really do think that there's a number of schools out there who may have consolidated if they could have. So are you aware?
I get lots of phone calls on this from superintendents and facilities managers. So this is conversations that have happened quite a lot. Had a conversation this morning with a facility manager who was talking about, they have a desire to potentially close one of their schools or change it over to a pre-K and after school and their central offices, but they need some additional dollars to add a wing to another school. So part of what we're describing as small by necessity is also, it's not just geographical isolation. It's maybe we have a school with 100 kids and just down the street, there's a school with 100 kids and we would love to move those kids over, but we actually have to add on additional space and capacity. So I think that this is, some districts are much further along in those conversations, I would say, and some districts, it would be starting the conversation sort of from the beginning. Yeah, it's absolutely an area of conversation and concern.
But just to follow up, that you haven't done an assessment in the state of how many have proposals out there trying to get them passed but can't because of that. Just
No,
it's
we
based
do
on
track
just
how many bonds go up.
right.
And
That I understand.
that's a different.
Okay,
different
thanks.
conversation.
That's all I'm.
We are having conversations across the state, through our listen and learn tour, we did regional planning in understanding what type of proposals are out there in terms of consolidation. There are sometimes, as you're describing, there may be limitations in terms of the actual facility, but we also hear that there's other barriers to being able to do that work and that there's a need for really greater clarity from the state around what those parameters are, because it's important that we're able to establish those guardrails to support that work in a way that's consistent across the state, because as we know, these are really challenging discussions and the field is really looking for some greater support and cover to do a lot of this work. So certainly we can come back and be able to share what we have identified in our conversations regionally is what are some of the barriers to engaging in that work.
Thank you.
Great. And I think my last slide, trying to get a visual representation of the flow of funds related to the CTE Center students. And so the way we're thinking about it is that each of those students is going to be generating base funding of 13,200, which would go to the district of record. And then each of the CTE Center FTE would also be producing about $17,000 through a student weight. So those are going to be kind of the original, that's how much is being generated. The 5,200 is going to go to the district. That is really there for other incurred costs like guidance, making, they are going to be giving out the diploma, also to help with some of the tension between districts sending a student and then not having the capacity, sending a student to CTE and losing that student and that economies of scale to provide other really robust programming for the students who stay in the district and that district high school. 8,000 is going to go directly to the CTE through an on behalf payment. And then the $17,000 from the weight would go to the CTE BOCES. So each of those FTE will generate $25,000 to the CTE BOCES. And then again, have dollars remaining to cover those incurred costs and those economies of scale issues and trying to, get rid of some of the tension we've heard about for years as we've studied this between sending a student and keeping them at that home high school.
So I'm gonna just ask, this helps a bit. So really what we're saying is a CTE student costs $30,000.
Yes.
And we're essentially buying away that tension that exists by paying the home district $5,000 to.
I think we're compensating for the responsibility.
Yeah, no, I get it. I get it.
Right,
I
and
get
then
it.
ensuring that that we're appropriately funding staffing and resources to have joint oversight and responsibility of that student's education.
And I think it's an articulation of a really clear stated priority, right? Which is to strengthen and support not only the CTE system, but access to CTE, which we know is another place where we know there's a lot of disparities in terms of access. So it's a reflection of a stated, if budgets are a reflection of priorities, this is a priority.
It's shared responsibility and it should be funded.
Yeah, it's the $30,000 a student part that's absolutely something to discuss.
Okay, so
All right.
we're gonna, move into, I think we've received a lot of questions just around the comparison. So how does this proposal compare to our current spending? It's important as we look at that comparison to really call out what the differences are within the two systems. So Amanda will walk through that, but as we talk about spending, just keep in mind that it also comes with assumptions around how we deliver education and how we scale our education system. So that's built into this, and we'll walk through how that plays out in terms of and you.
Thank you. So I want to start off by, again, we tried to do our best to make things as apples to apples as we could. There's still a bit, the new system and the current system are pretty different. So it can be challenging to compare the two. So I'm going to try to call out how we've tried to make that adjustment. So the first thing I want to talk about is that base funding. So we looked at what you're going to see here is first row is the statewide average, and then looking in within districts by size and by need, kind of grouping in the different categories. But we start off, the first couple columns are what we're recommending. So you'll see very first off, the base and the foundation formula is that 13,200 that we've talked about. When we look at total funding then per long-term weighted ADM, so that's accounting for the additional funding that comes through size, through, does not count the size and all that. That's part of weighted, my bad. So take a step back. I just made that a little confusing for you all. So the base, so really it's only accounting for those additional categorical adjustments. And when I say that, it's what Justin was talking about earlier, that extra $740 per student for special education, and the extra $300 per student for transportation. We are counting it as we compare to current because those funding amounts are being funded out of your current ed spend. So again, this is a place of trying to make it a little more apples to apples. Even though we're treating it as a categorical, currently it's funded out of what would be kind of your base funding. So we're trying to map them. So when you do that on a statewide average, it's that $13,700 once you account for those pieces. And then education spending. Oh, and sorry, the reason it doesn't total up to the 740 plus the 300 is it's also where we're accounting for the fact that we're reducing some categorical funding that districts currently have access through for the technical education, for flexible pathways, for EL services and small adjustments. So when you net it out, it's little shy of $700 total between all of those categorical adjustments. So comparing that to current, I want to show you two comparison figures. So the first one is FY25 ed spend per our recommended long-term weighted ADM. So that's a new calculation. The one just to the right is what you're probably more familiar with seeing, which is your per pupil spending or PPS, which is your ed fund by your current Act 127 long-term weighted ADM. So I wanted to show you both because I think it's, again, trying to make it apples to apples. You would want to compare the two long-term weighted ADMs that are using the same long-term weighted ADM. So when we look at that, your current ed spend per recommended long-term weighted ADM over the whole state is about 15,000. If we looked at what's kind of your implied, your per pupil spend using your current weights, that's actually about $13,000 and pretty similar to what we're recommending in the base. So part of what that tells us is that your current districts are spending more in some places and spending less and not really accessing those full tax capacity weights. But when we look under the hood, then what does that look like by district size? You can see it's actually pretty consistent in any of the columns if you're looking by size. There's not a lot of difference based on size in that kind of base levels funding if we think about it per weighted student. It is very different though when we look at it per district need. So under our recommended approach, it's very similar, a little variation when we think about adjusting for those categorical adjustments, but relatively the same. However, when we look at your current ed spend, either per our recommended long-term weighted ADM or per your current Act 127, you can see there's about a $2,000 difference on a per student, per weighted student level by need. So your low need places are spending about $2,000 more once you account for the need of the communities than your high need places. So that's something to really be thinking about in your current system. So I think we can go to the next slide there.
Amanda, would you actually mind
Yep.
pausing there? I want you to
Yeah,
say
please.
that last part again, because there was a ton of information, but the last
Yep.
part I think is really important about the high needs. So our higher free and reduced lunch communities are spending about $2,000 less per pupil than our low need communities.
Yep, they're spending per weighted student less. So after your system has accounted for what it thinks you would need to adjust for need to get to that kind of per weighted student category, you're seeing your low need communities spend $2,000 more than your high need communities. So you have a lot of variation. And if we end up needing it, I made a chart that shows you just have a lot of variation if you look at that spending per weighted student in your current system.
Can I
And that's
ask a
really-
question?
Yes, please.
And this is really, am I reading this right question?
Yeah.
Your point is well taken that a high FRL district, according to this, in current reality, is spending perhaps $2,000 less per pupil than a lower one. Under the recommended two boxes, they're still spending at that low level.
Correct. So that's when we think about the base. So we'll see on the next slide.
Okay.
What does it
All right.
look
So
like
now
when you
I've
then
got it.
also add the extra
Thanks.
dollars?
Thank
But
you.
yeah, your goal in the system would be to have very similar spending on a weighted student level. You wouldn't want to see that variation after your system's already accounted for what it thinks are needs that generate higher costs. So let's go to the next one. And I think we can kind of see so this slide is now comparing total funding to total recommended funding, which is now including that base funding, size adjustments, sparsity, all those student need weights, kind of on a more per student basis instead of a per weighted student, is a per a long-term ADM. And you can see the difference between the recommended funding in that first column and your current spend. It is a difference overall of about 8% less is what we say statewide as a whole should be spending. You'll see when we look by district size, that percentage difference is pretty comparable across the size groups. What's interesting to look at right now, back to that idea of your lower need places are currently spending less than your high need places are currently spending more than your low need places. In our recommendation.
I need less. Yeah.
I need less.
Yeah, right. Yeah, it catches myself. I have to think about it. I'm like, high is more. Yeah. But what we're saying is that while it's an overall net reduction, the recommended funding per ADM, so per student, is higher than FY25 spending in 36 districts, or about 30% of your districts, and primarily your higher need districts. So we're recommending they're spending more than they currently are under current funding levels as a grand total.
And that would make sense based on what we've described, and that we know some of our higher needs communities are not taking advantage of that tax capacity, and so we're seeing that out. So with this being able to guarantee that students with similar needs have similar resources, you would expect that we would have our higher needs communities being able to spend.
Exactly. That's the disconnect we were seeing behind the intention of your system with its tax capacity rates and the reality of what's happening in your communities.
Just real, very quickly, 36 districts, that's out of the 119.
119. Yeah. Actually, I think it's actually out of 122, because I think there's 3 non-operating that we don't count when we think of the 119.
Just confirm. Thanks.
Yeah. And then a last couple slides before we open it broader for questions. The overall spending in the future state. This is where it's tricky to answer the question of where do the savings come from for a couple reasons. One, the foundation formula is based on a desired future state. So it's using that evidence-based model of what the research says is needed to support student success, plus those Vermont context and priority adjustments that we've talked about. So from that approach, the resource estimates are really developed from scratch versus kind of starting from the current and making reductions to get to cost savings. So it's a bit of a directionality challenge. We didn't, with making these recommendations, start from what you're spending now, and instead think about what would it cost to provide the system that we're recommending in the future. Again, it also represents the recommended amount of funding that the state, and then therefore Vermonters collectively, should be responsible for providing. So it does not include any additional local funding. And I just want to raise that when we see that difference between communities at that base level, your system is still picking up and paying for the variation of different communities. Different communities bear more of the burden, but still collectively as a whole, communities are facing increased taxes because of increased spending in other communities, and not receiving that same level of funding for their own students. So again, it doesn't include any additional local funding. That's a separate policy decision and conversation if you want to allow additional local above and beyond what the state should be responsible for. And we talked about that variation that you have in spending between communities right now. So that means that differences between recommended and current spending differ widely by community due to their existing variation. And then we are seeing no change or increases in about a third of communities, which are often high need. So again, it's a net reduction overall for the whole state, but not in every single community. And then to Secretary Saunders' point earlier, local communities will decide how to use funding. So it's, again, hard to quantify exactly where savings will come from when people can choose to use dollars differently from place to place. So going to
I'm
the
sorry,
next,
the last statement here, overall spending in a future state, local communities will decide how to use funding. I mean, in the state that is envisioned in Governor Scott's proposal.
In the proposed
Correct.
5 school districts.
Yeah, okay.
So what we've modeled in here is, again, to make sure that the amount being provided will resource a very well-rounded whole child education. And so there's assumptions built in around how you can staff for that at different size schools. We are also building into this assumptions around class size. And then beyond that, there's flexibility with how you might make adjustments. So you might have a mental health counselor, you might have a community schools coordinator, right? So those are the types of adjustments that would be made based on the needs of the community. So we would love to come back next week and provide some examples around how you would do budgeting. So thinking about a school district of about 15,000, we'll kind of quantify what the needs are. Here are the dollars that would be available. What are the different choices that can be made with budgeting? So the one choice might be to continue to have and operate very small elementary schools. That's a choice that affects other budgeting other places. You might make a different choice to think about expanding high school programming, and how do you actually support that? There may need to be some consolidation conversations at the elementary middle level. So those are the types of choices that as a new district in a much larger region would have local control in making to be able to meet the needs of their communities.
Just to be clear, the word community is a little vague, a little
The larger-
abstract. We're talking about the larger school district versus
Yes.
smaller school districts as we have today.
Yes.
Yes, next question.
Yes, a couple. Am I reading correctly in the longer narrative of the materials we got on Friday with all the kind of methodology that the identified efficient district size is about 3,900 students? That is a number that a lot of the assumptions are based on. This is probably a question for APA.
Minimum.
But then there's adjustments based on size of the district. Or
No,
the
that's
central
exactly
office.
right. That's at the point where you start on a per student level, seeing your costs be relatively flat. So when we talk about an efficiency point, that's what we mean, is that at that point, whether you have 3,900 students or 20,000, your costs on a per student level are the same or similar.
Okay, so I think then that this is much more probably the political question then of, so if we're talking about the sort of efficiency peak of districts of, about 4,000 kids, why are we talking about districts of 34,000 kids when that's such a huge shift and change? And I don't see the mechanism, but yeah, in the modeling, we're also talking about very different school size shifts. And so the proposal seems to have very clear, here are the district sizes, we're gonna do these big districts that are quite a bit larger than what is offered as the most efficient. But then we're also modeling based on school sizes that we don't have, nor does there seem to be a clear way that we get to those school sizes. Like, it feels like this very incompatible modeling between district size and school size and our current state.
Zoe, I'll let you
schools-
field the
Yeah.
governance question, but perhaps
Yeah.
before we get into that one on the school size, the way that the formula is designed right now is to allow you to keep the current size of your schools by having applying the size adjustment to all of your current schools. I should name that that's not to say that the staffing within the schools might not need a change within the both the recommended, and I think it'll be on the next slide, both the recommended funding that's available and also any recommendations around minimum class sizes or different education quality changes. But so the system is intended to be responsive to how your school portfolio flexes. So it adjusts for size now, then you set the criteria for which schools can receive it to then change who's eligible within the portfolio of schools. So that's the intention of that piece, is to be a little more flexible and responsive to how that may change over time, knowing that any changes to the school portfolio are a longer term conversation. You couldn't do that on day one. You could not say, well, great, now we only have 100 schools. That clearly wouldn't work. I'll let perhaps Zoe or Jill speak to the conversation around the 5 districts. I just wanted to add on in the school.
So I think just to reinforce that in terms of the modeling, it is assuming in the first year or two that we would have the same number of schools, but there would be adjustments with staffing. So you do have some schools that are already operating at that optimum efficiency, are doing their budgets to align staffing to enrollment, are effectively sharing resources across schools, and you have others that are not. And so part of the kind of the broader policies around having education quality standards and guardrails would be establishing those parameters, because we know that you can achieve this high quality education with the funding available, but it does require some adjustments in terms of how you would staff and resource those schools. So I think that's an important consideration when we think about that transition. In terms of the district size, I think back to the last legislative session, there was a lot of conversation around how do we provide the shared services and support that's needed. There was a recognition that within our current structure, many districts will struggle to bring in specialized services and resources, special ed and other areas to provide that envelope, particularly around our smaller schools and our smaller districts. At the time, the legislature passed the BOCES bill, Board of Cooperative Education Services, and that really is another layer on top of our existing system to provide that service. And I think there's been some questions around designed well that can work effectively, but it could also run the risk of creating additional bureaucracy on top of an overly bureaucratic school governance factor and potentially an additional cost. So when you think about these broader regions of a school district, it's not exactly what we think about with our current central office staff of our superintendent and some of the core administrators. It's also thinking about having a robust central office that is providing some of the additional specialized services in terms of education preparation and other support that is needed for the larger region. So I think it's important to make that distinction that this is not just thinking about, it's thinking about our central office differently and having expanded capacities to provide that support. And then when we're talking about the BOCES, we do recognize that there's a role for that statewide in terms of being able to provide those specialized services in CTE and special ed. But your central office is also more robust in meeting the needs of your schools. The other factors we think about the geography is really looking to achieve some sort of consistency in terms of need of the student population. So you'll see in the maps that we shared within the 5 districts, it's pretty similar in terms of free and reduced lunch. It's also similar when you compare property wealth. So when we think about conversations around Brigham and the potential for raising additional local dollars, that parity and property wealth is something that is important to consider because we know that there would need to be some sort of equalization mechanism in place at the state to ensure that every community has the equal ability to raise funds should we make those policy decisions.
I might follow up on this whole idea of ideal school district size. I'm not sure that 15,000 is in the literature that I've seen. And I'm just curious to know, it's probably a question for the consultants, whether you, at a certain point, you reach economies of scale that then are in reverse, because you might need 3 business managers rather than 12, but then you add 1 more and then you need to have another layer of supervision. I'm just curious to know if there is a point at which you sort of move from it being slimmed down, nimble, the size you want, versus getting too big. So now you've got supervisors of people who didn't need supervisors before, that sort of thing.
I think it's a very good. Yeah, I was just going to say that's a very
sweet spot.
Exactly. And I was going to say, Justin, I'd look to you if you know the specific numbers. From what our experience, you don't hit those like inefficiencies until you get to very large districts, well above the size that you could, even above the number of students you have statewide, before I think you would start having that issue. But Justin, if there's any more specifics you want to put on that.
No, man, I think you're absolutely right. I think that there are no states, I believe, who adjust for that, larger size inefficiency or economies of scale issue. But again, I think as Amanda said, the districts even that we're talking about, which seem very, very big for Vermont, would not fit into that profile of becoming, inefficient on the large side.
And I would just sort of, as you're thinking through this, I think certainly there's other governance structures that could be contemplated. And so I think it's just a matter of what we've sort of articulated here is that we landed on this not by accident, right? We started in different places and we modeled different ways to organize this. This wasn't the first thing that we came up with.
Mhm.
And so we landed on this because through a series of, you know, understanding what our goals were, this was the model that actually achieved those goals. And when we did the modeling around property tax wealth, the characteristics of students being able to deliver at a regional level, what we're sort of hoping that BOCES might do, this was the structure that fit those goals. And we were able to have sort of really clearly articulated reasons why we landed on it. So I think just as you're contemplating other ways to organize, it's that same sort of what is our goal, right? And I want to like recognize this feels big and it feels different. So we're not ignoring that. But what is the goal that you're trying to achieve? And this was the way that we were able to achieve that in really clear terms. And as we did the modeling, what arose from it was we were achieving these things that we said we wanted to do.
So I think you're bringing up kind of one of the crucial questions here. And there are our goals, sort of like for education, there are our goals for the people that we represent, Vermonters. And I think it's fair to say that the idea of a 5-district state is a pretty big, it's a very tall offer to put out there and say, we're going to move there. So my question would be, the foundation formula that we have in front of us is predicated on the 5 districts. Is there sort of do you have a table or whatever that says, well, if we moved the number of districts lever up, then the foundation formula moves in this direction?
Joint fiscal office has all of the data available and could do.
I want to ask the question is that doable?
Yeah, so I mean,
Maybe a different system, yeah.
yeah, I mean, I think all of everything's very interconnected to you, right? And so any adjustment to one component, whether we establish different class size ratios, right, would affect the modeling as well. If we establish different district configurations, that would affect the modeling. If we make different choices around what to prioritize in the base, that affects all of the modeling. So it's all very interconnected as you're describing. I think one thing that's really important is what are we hoping to achieve? So to your question around, smaller districts, what are we hoping to achieve with smaller districts? And then I think, as we've all talked about, there's multiple pathways to get to a goal. But I think it's really important for us to articulate what that goal is, because this is very different, right? So it is important for us to pause and think about what could we get here. So if you think about, this is a different structure where, we're able to pay our educators more. You're able to have broader regional support system in place where we have services that right now many districts cannot access. There's a certain scale that we need to get to be able to deliver on those. And so there's also a broader conversation around statewide capacity. When we think about what type of services and support are needed from agency of education to the districts to the schools is all part of this conversation, and really thinking about how we develop an approach that's really going to support the entire state, and thinking about what expertise and resources do we need at every level. We know that there's also conversations around engagement, right? Like, how do we promote engagement within this model? It's really shifting the thinking from engaging around the decisions around the budget and thinking about how do you engage locally with your school in making decisions around how to resource your school with the funding available. So it is a shift, and we recognize that. Part of what we're working on is to more clearly describe what this government structure would look like and what some of those additional value added opportunities there are with scale, while still allowing for that engagement at the school level, right? And that's the balance that I think we're all trying to strike, because it is really important that that local customization is part of the system.
And articulating the experience of the student, parent, the community member, the district office, the educator. What does it look like in this system? It is a lot. I'm going to repeat something that Zoe just said, which is, let's contemplate what we gain from this structure, which feels big and different, but what might be gained from having it this way?
And I think it would be safe to say that if we were starting with an empty state that had no infrastructure or school or anybody living in it, and we wanted to create from scratch, everything you're saying is right on the money. It's how do we navigate 250 years of tradition, evolution?
Yeah.
And that's, and when we talk about what we lose and what we gain, or when we talk about what we gain, this group can't not talk about what we lose.
Sure.
Yeah, person agree.
I have to ask a more specific question along those very lines of, if I look at the 4 biggest districts in the state, one of which is right above 3,900 and 3 that are hovering near it, so near what we consider scale, all operating high schools well above model school size, and elementaries that are in some cases right on or close. So, certainly maybe some shifting to happen there, but we're talking pretty close to the model numbers. My understanding of those 4 districts is that between at least 2 of them, if we're looking at the numbers of this future state against their current budgeting, and budgets that will be approved hopefully in a couple months here, it would be a net reduction of somewhere between $40 and $50 million for those 4 districts, students in those 4 districts. What are families in the 4 largest districts in our state that are in schools that are operating at scale gaining from this plan and this transformation? I mean, that's the question my constituents and my schools are asking me, and we have to be able to answer.
Yeah. So as you can imagine, we're also fielding a lot of questions from specific school board members and superintendents who are engaged in doing this modeling. What would this look like if this formula were implemented? So we're having some follow-up to make sure that they're taking into account all of the different weights and adjustments and categorical aid as they're looking at this holistically, so that we do have that opportunity to compare more apples to apples. So we will be able, specific, I think, to some of the questions you have, we're already engaged in those conversations and setting up meetings where we really roll up our sleeves, look at the data, look at the numbers, and make sure that we can be supportive in that process of understanding what that delta could be, but also recognizing that the dollars are part of a much larger district, right? So there are different choices that can be made within the district around how to resource the entire school portfolio. So we are doing that on a school by school, but there are bigger choices to be made that could allow you to resource differently at different levels of the system. And what we'd love to bring back next week is some kind of examples of scenarios of how we go through that. We're also partnering with New Solutions K-12, which many of our districts have worked very closely with, who's helping us to do that modeling and make it a little bit more concrete. What we've shared today is that we know that there's a need to, and the field for people to understand, what does this mean for my specific school, right? And so there's work to be done to really make sure that that modeling is being done holistically and that they're factoring in all the considerations. But then we also do need to step back and think about it as an overall system where there are different choices to be made within the portfolio of schools.
I do think it would be very helpful if we had at least a couple of specific examples,
Yes.
looking at our largest districts.
Yes.
And saying, in this case, maybe the district you're talking about did their math wrong. But maybe they gotta figure out how to
Not
save $20 million.
Including everything.
Yeah,
Yeah.
So, but
Yeah.
those are really important questions, and we've already committed to the field of having those follow-ups. We're scheduling those right now to really dive deeper, and that's particularly true for the larger districts where we're having those conversations. So yes, we are committed to doing that work.
So I'd say we have talked around the very emotional issue of closing small schools or inefficient schools. I think the language in the policy brief said something like schools that were found to be, let's just say, non-viable or whatever, would be invited to merge with another school as if they would consider that an opportunity.
Mhm.
And it's the question I have is more not whether we have too many school buildings and if that's costing us money. I think that question is answered. It would be more of, under this future state, how does that happen? Is it the smaller school board that is frankly just gonna have to make the call, or is it an AOE thing?
So as part of the overall transition planning, as you know, there's going to be a shift in this proposed model from the existing board structure to the new board structure. The current boards would be really focusing on the closeout activities and doing an inventory and evaluation of where they are, right? That's an opportunity from the ground up to highlight where there are challenges, opportunities, considerations that the future board would need to contemplate as they do the broader planning. And then within the new districts, there would need to be work done in reviewing all of that, self-evaluation through the district quality standards, really thinking holistically around the whole district and how to organize in terms of creating those really strong feeding patterns in different zones across the district. And that would need to be part of the new district's decision-making. We know that there needs to be a lot of strong guidance around that work so that there is fairness in how districts approach that across the state. And so we would be working to develop those tools and resources along with policy decisions that the General Assembly would make as we think about how do we really define education quality and financial solvency. Right? Those are going to be two important guideposts to this work.
Great.
The
And then
small.
maybe you and I will be quite more expressive.
Maybe.
We also were supposed to be down with Bennett in 7 minutes.
Okay,
Yeah.
last question.
Really quick question.
We will
probably
be
for
back.
APA, the small school adjustment piece that you walked us through, the glide path.
Uh-huh.
How many years does that piece exist in your modeling?
So that the adjustment itself would continue forever in the formula, or as long as until you update the formula again. It's who's eligible to receive it, the criteria that could change over time, but the adjustment itself would not change in the formula because you will always have schools that are small by necessity that you need to adjust for the costs of.
But those 50, 100, those will continue to exist?
The adjustments for those size.
So the initial,
Yes, that
I think I'm going to answer your question.
Yep.
The modeling of the overall spending assumes that those smaller schools exist within the portfolio. Additional cost savings and efficiency could be achieved through consolidation. And that's where we would need to be clear around defining those criteria, those parameters to achieving that.
But I would also add that the modeling that you're seeing there, and I think this is what Amanda was pointing to, we will have schools that by necessity, however we define that, will continue to be small. And so what APA has done is made some changes to our current small school weight so that it is that glide path. That weight will continue to exist, but who gets the benefit of that weight as being small by necessity, however we define that, that's outside the funding system. That's a policy choice. And that is, exactly, I think, sort of what you've been pointing to is how are we defining which schools are small by necessity and which are small by choice? That's something that we need to articulate through policy, but it's agnostic of the funding system.
All right.
Well
lot
said, Jill.
more
Thank you.
there. A lot more there, but I do want you to be on time. So we'll close here. Plenty more to discuss in the future. Thanks for the time.